Hello. We have a lot to talk about. As leaders, we're tasked with two things that are our major responsibilities during a crisis. The first is to survive. Of course, if our business doesn't survive, it doesn't really matter much about the future. But the second is to adjust. Every crisis has consequences that have long-term implications, and our challenge as leaders is to understand those. Perhaps under the heading of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger may literally apply to individuals. It doesn't necessarily apply to businesses. For that, we need to do more. In 2015, every person who interviewed for a job, every person who sat for a performance evaluation and was asked the question, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Got it wrong. Your job as a leader is to get that answer right. And for that, we need to look into the future. We need to look around the corner. About 10 years ago, we started the current path of a rising economy that was generally upward and consistent. And for many of you, that meant long-term planning was more or less a year because the base of assumptions that you're using could be more or less the same this year as they were last year. So predicting the future had everything to do with just using that same base of assumptions and looking at what you were going to do in the coming year based on those assumptions. You're conditioned now to kind of think in shorter term cycles. And now we're confronted with dramatic change. And that dramatic change is what I'm going to talk about because you have to understand it and you have to understand how those implications are going to carry forward beyond the crisis. FRANdata's team hasn't been this challenged in our advisory work and the research work that we do for many of you since shortly after the end of the last recession in 2009. The Great Recession was a financial recession. And our focus then was capital access. As I'm sure all of you recall, there was none. It shut down. Financial markets were frozen. And gradually that sort of wound its way back into a new lending environment. But with that came a whole new way of franchises presenting themselves to the lending community. Lenders wanted to understand more than they were historically able to decipher around franchising. The assumptions that lenders were using prior to the Great Recession were that if it's a franchise, it has a fairly predictable outcome. It turns out that's not always the case, so they wanted to understand that more. That led to FRANdata creating bank credit reports, evolving into the whole fund scoring model, credit risk model that aligned what franchisors were saying and what they were showing with what lenders were concerned about. Every crisis has consequences. Some are more dramatic than others. When we're in the middle of it, as we are now, it's hard to understand how the world is changing after the fact. We want it to kind of go back to a normal. We had that expression, a new normal, coming out of the Great Recession, but by and large, the new normal had everything to do with financial institutions because that's what the crisis is about. This crisis is about people. It's about consumers. And it's going to change their behaviors. It has to. And the implications of those changed behaviors are what we're going to look at and spend some time understanding.